Hello and welcome. My name is Amy. I'm a PhD candidate in sociology at Stanford University, and today I'm going to be talking about workflow for quantitative analyses. And a portion of these materials were adapted from Scott Long's book, The Workflow of Data Analysis Using Stata, but I want to clarify that workflow is not specific to Stata. It can apply to any quantitative project using any software. So let's start by talking about what workflow is. In his book, Long describes workflow as a coordinated framework for conducting data analysis. Essentially, it's a strategy that a researcher brings into their quantitative projects that helps them organize all the different steps of doing a research project. Workflow is often part of the hidden curriculum in academia. It's tacit knowledge, right? So many people have a strategy for workflow, and yet we don't teach students explicitly how to develop a strategic and solid workflow. But at the same time, a good workflow can make or break both your career as an academic and your sanity as a researcher, right? So it's really important to doing good science and also staying sane and staying organized when conducting research. So why should we think consciously about workflow? The first set of reasons has to do with making your own life easier, right? By having a good workflow, you can remember what you did, you make sure that you're not losing files, and you can reduce the confusion and chaos that often accompanies a quantitative research project. Having a good workflow also makes it easier to find and fix mistakes because you can track down where exactly in your research process the error is occurring. And so overall workflow can really make your own life as a researcher easier and sort of help you do good research and keep yourself organized. The other reason to think consciously about workflow is that having a good workflow can contribute to scientific best practices like open science and replication. So in the culture of open science, which focuses on transparency and replication, you should be able to, in theory, publicly post all of your analysis materials that you used in your research project. And anyone with those materials should get the exact same results that you are putting in your paper. This is kind of the core principles of open science. And by thinking consciously about your workflow, you can make sure that you are following these best practices and doing science that is open and replicable. Okay, so what do I mean by workflow? And here's where I'm really drawing from Scott Long's book and talking about the 4 tiers of workflow. Oftentimes when we're doing a quantitative project, we begin at the stage of computing, right? We get really excited, we have data, we want to start analyzing it. So we open maybe Stata or R or whatever software we're using, and we immediately begin analyzing the data. Oftentimes this computing is accompanied by some form of documentation. And so maybe we're using an R script or a do file and keeping track of what we're doing there. However, computing shouldn't necessarily be your first step in a good workflow, right? So I have it moved to the right side of the screen because there are some initial steps that we should take before we begin computing. And mostly these involve planning. Right, so research involves a lot of decisions, and each decision is crucial to your outcome of the research project. And you want to make sure you're thinking consciously about these decisions and planning in advance how you're going to approach your research project. Right, so you don't just want to open up the data and start coding, but you want to come in with a plan, with an approach, and with a strategy towards the decision making that any sort of computing or quantitative analyses are going to involve. Along with planning, you should make sure you're keeping organized. You want to make really consistent and explicit decisions about your file storage. You should know where the files are on your computer, what they are. You should label them clearly. You should be able to find every file or document that relates to your project. Right, so this involves having a consistent file structure for your folders, having a consistent structure for your code files, essentially staying organized so that you can keep track of everything that you're doing. And both of these steps, planning and organizing, happen before you even begin computing or even begin analyzing the data. And in my other videos, I've talked about the importance of documenting each individual code file, right? So you want to use some sort of template when you open a new do file or an R script to make sure that you're staying organized and really clearly writing down what that document is doing. But you also want to make sure with any quantitative project that you're documenting the project as a whole and thinking really holistically about those decisions that you're making as you're planning. In my opinion, you will never regret documentation. So you'll never regret taking as many notes as possible, but you want to make sure you're doing that as you go, because looking back retroactively, it may be much harder to write down what you did than it is to write down what you're doing. You should also make sure to return to your documentation later. So for example, if you need to take a break from a project for several months, you should be able to return to the documentation you did as you were working on the project in order to reorient yourself and think about how the project was going. Even if you don't take a break from your project, you should return to your early documentation to make sure that it still makes sense and that it's still in line with what you're doing in the project. So in Long's book, he talks about dual workflow, and this is the idea that data cleaning and data analysis should be kept separate. You should have different do files if you're using Stata, or R scripts if you're using R, that each tackle cleaning and analysis separately. You should also separate any raw data from the clean data that you're using in your analysis, and really keep track of different data sets using different folders, especially if you're using multiple data sets. In Long's book, he makes a really good case for why this should happen, so I'm not going to spend too much time. Basically, you just want to make sure that your analysis is always being conducted on your cleanest data, and by separating these two into different files, you make sure that you're not skipping a step when you run code or when you start running your analyses. I have a strategy that I call triple workflow, which I guess is a fun play on dual workflow. And this is where I keep an overall project workflow document, just like a Word doc or a note in my computer, where I write down everything that I do for my quantitative projects, and I write down every decision that I make. This document also keeps track of all the files that I'm using in my project, so do files or R scripts, any data files, any files where I'm doing writing or literature. And it also keeps notes to myself about my overall research plan, right? So I keep all my planning and organizing in this document, as well as a guide to the files that I'm using. This document's really helpful when you begin writing up your method section, because you can see all of the methodological steps that you took, and you can write them down into a formal document based directly off of this workflow document. It's also incredibly necessary to keep track of all the analytical decisions that you made throughout the process. For example, why did you code this category of one variable as missing, or why did you recode this variable in this way? If you keep everything in this workflow document, you'll be able to remember what you did and why you did it. So in total, you have, first and foremost, this overall project workflow document. And in this document, you're doing some planning, some organizing, and some documentation. You're not doing any analysis, but you're doing the other 3 steps of workflow. Then you'll have a data cleaning workflow, often done through some sort of code script. And here you're doing the planning, organizing, computing, and documentation. And finally, you have a data analysis workflow, also in which you're planning, organizing, computing, and documenting. And what I want to note is that both the data cleaning and data analysis workflows are described and organized within this overall project workflow, right? So you have kind of this umbrella workflow where you're keeping track of all the different pieces that are going into this. So everyone's workflow is different, even if you do follow my suggestions here. But I want to talk through an example workflow for a quantitative project to kind of put this in a really concrete way. So as always, we begin with planning. You want to think holistically about your research project. You want to create a workflow document first and foremost. In the document, you want to write down your research questions so that you can refer back to them and remember exactly what you're trying to do with this project. You might start to think about what variables you're planning on using and how you're going to operationalize them given the data that you have. And one interesting aspect of planning that one of my colleagues recommends is sketching the dream figure or dream table that you would want to include in a written version of this project. And then thinking about what do you need to do with the data in order to construct that figure or construct that table. The idea of planning is you want to remember both where you're starting and where you want to go. right? So what are your research questions that you're trying to answer? And at the end of the day, how do you want to show your answer to those questions? Alongside planning, you want to make sure you're staying organized, right? So you might set up a folder for this project with subfolders that can contain the data, either raw or cleaned, folders that can contain your analysis and code documents, maybe a folder for writing and all the different drafts that you'll do as you're writing up the project, and finally, some way to keep track of the literature that you're referencing and citing. Here's where labeling becomes really important. And you want to also make sure that you are consistently keeping track of versions. So whether you're going to use dates or some sort of version numbering system, you don't want to end up with documents that are labeled like old underscore project or new underscore project or something very mysterious about what that document could contain. Once you start planning and organizing, you can finally begin computing. Right? You can clean your data, you can run your analyses using these two separate workflows and two separate code documents. In computing, you want to be efficient and accurate. You want to automate as much as possible. There's a lot of work done about how to maintain strong workflow at this stage in the process. And so there's lots of great resources for that. Finally, as you go, you want to make sure you're documenting everything that you're doing. So keep track of the project decisions you made in your main workflow document. As you write code, make sure it's annotated with what you did and why you did it, and make sure you're returning to this documentation quite frequently as you work on the project. Finally, what I want to note is that all of the arrows connecting these pillars of workflow are dual-ended, right? So it's not that you plan and then organize and then compute and then document, but rather you're doing all of these different things all at once. And while this can feel a little bit chaotic, as long as you make sure you're maintaining good organization, good documentation, you're planning what you're doing, it will feel less chaotic if you follow this structure and sort of make sense of the chaos. So that's all for this video. Thanks so much for watching. I hope that this helps you as you begin quantitative projects. And I'm putting a link in the video description with a document that summarizes everything I talked about here. So I hope it's useful in your future research, and thanks so much for listening.